about, some of the connections, some of the historical backgrounds that connect, settler colonization and decolonization in Turtle Island and Palestine. It's kind of a lot. I've prepared a lot of stuff here. We don't necessarily have to get through it all, but I thought maybe before I got started with the formal teach-in bit, as everybody's kind of getting settled, I wanted to say a few words about this class that probably a good half of you are in, so you already know about, but for the folks who aren't in it, a group of Zeitoun campers and I get to hang out every week in this class called The Praxis of Encampment, Settler Colonialism in Turtle Island and Palestine. And, originally that class came about as a bit of a middle finger to the Dalhousie administration for having the audacity to kick these campers off of their own campus. We thought it would be funny and ironic for their students to actually receive university credit for being thrown off of the university. But I think quickly it transformed into a lot more than that, in part because of the seriousness with which the students have always brought to this class. Every single class. So the way that, as studying the praxis of encampment, a lot of the talk that I'm going to be building on here is emerging from the common intellectual space as a class that we've been able to cultivate since the beginning of September to now, as a way of kind of celebrating the intellectual foundations of Zeitoun University. Because if it wasn't for Zeitoun University, it's got fuck all to do with DAL or NSCAD or SMU or any of the rest of them. It's Zeitoun University that forced open a space in which we can start formally engaging with conversations like this. Because as a faculty member, and I see other faculty members here, the amount of pressure of an official and unofficial levels that we get to simply shut up about Palestine in general, but then obviously in the last year it's been a little bit more intense. It has such a dampening effect on the vast majority of faculty that my greatest fear is that at a time of genocide, there is nowhere near enough people actually investigating some of the historical foundations and causes for this genocide. And folks are ultimately just waiting for the opportunity to line up and say, never again, and pretend like they always gave a damn. And that's a bunch of bullshit. And that's why the spaces that Zeitoun University builds and the community that supports it is so important, because I do think it's one of the few sites, the encampment was one of the longest standing encampments across this vast continent, which is a huge accomplishment in and of itself. And the intellectual spaces that, I almost think we should probably try to give some thought to some kind of a book project about all the different things that you all have actually been teaching about and talking about over the course of the last, half a year or more. But anyway, that's kind of where, I wanted to start with that, because the class, we've been moving through a lot of literature. We started the class talking about a book called The Colonial Present by Derek Gregory. And that looked at case studies in Palestine, Afghanistan, and Iraq, written in the year 2004, and really highlighting the kind of geopolitics, the racialization of the so-called war on terror. And there are so many different potential foundations that we could start with to look at what's happening right now. That was one among many. I'm going to offer a different one later on in this talk. But starting with the geopolitics of the situation 20 years ago was really, I think, significant, because we saw how, 20 years ago, when nobody was, well, I shouldn't say nobody, when the masses were not as aware of what was happening in Palestine, what was going on in Palestine was still awful. It was still awful. It was reprehensible. International agreements were being forged around this whole thing. The racialization of threats, particularly the representation of Islam itself as inherently threatening, really accelerated in ways that, some of you who maybe, the older ones among us here remember the war on terror and the beginning part really, really well. For me, it was the defining aspect of my intellectual life, because I was an undergrad student at the beginning of the war on terror. So as this moment of genocide might be a politicizing moment for many students now, the War on Terror was a critical starting point for me. From there, we've been reading a specific book called Advocating for Palestine in Canada, which has been full of interesting, really detailed empirical chapters. Our friends from Seed and Spark are here. I saw lots of copies of the book there last night. And then from now, where we're at right now is we're reading a book called Decolonizing Palestine by Somdeep Sen, which, in many ways is a challenging read, published in 2022, and it's a deep dive into the simultaneousness of post-colonialism and anti-colonialism, looking specifically at Hamas. And obviously that's a challenging subject right now, but I think it's so important to remember the kind of dualities at play here, and that armed resistance to an illegal occupation and a genocide is actually something that we have to be seriously entertaining. And the discourse of terror continues to link all of this sort of thing. When we think about it seriously, in terms of people that have actually risen up to try to stop a genocide, the Houthis, the fighters in Gaza, the fighters in Lebanon, for all its many problems, Iran itself. This is simply an empirical reality that there have not been did Canada do anything? Did the United States do anything? Ireland did a little bit, but again, still talking. Everybody wants to talk. Very few people try to intervene. And I think we have to remember that when we put this in a historical context, that 5 years from now, we give no quarter to the people who are like, well, we were always on side. Well, then where were you? What were you doing? Where was your advocacy? We have to be able to remember that. And with that in mind, I'm going to talk a little bit about decolonization in Palestine and Canada, because the take I'm going to take on it today is a historical one, thinking about what's needed for decolonization, and how it requires, in my mind anyway, and this is the lens that I look through things, we need to understand the logic of imperial state formation in the 19th century. And that's in some ways a weird place to start too, right? Because most people, yesterday started us with the Bible, literally the Bible, and logically passing around maps of Palestine. I understand where he's coming from. So Canada, but my take on this is that the modern state system is something really particular. It's different from the Bible. It's different from Rome. It's different from lots of previous forms of state formation, and it has a very particular history that's grounded and invested in structural white supremacy. And I can't help but wonder, as NSCAD kicked us all out of the building, I don't know what it is they thought is so dangerous about these ideas, but having been working on white fragility for a long time now, I think even saying these words out loud is sometimes terrifying to administrators and faculty who would rather just pretend that it's not happening. So we can talk openly about white fragility, settler fragility. These are things that are necessary conceptions if we are to understand our political moment. Canada and Israel are both settler colonial, they're both modern, they're both territorial, and they're both nation states. And importantly, they both emerge from imperial, British, Christian logics. And I'm not saying all of that to throw any one of these subjectivities under the bus. I'm not trying to throw Christians under the bus. What I'm saying is when we are engaging in a historical analysis, we have to be truthful about the things that actually happened in the real world, as opposed to the things that we might have wished could have happened instead. And Christianization was a massive part of the imperial logic of the 19th century. So as showed us yesterday, Palestine as a physical geography has been mapped and discussed in texts even older than the Bible, the Christian Bible. And similarly, we know from Mi'kmaq knowledge holders, historians, and storytellers that Ilnu have developed alongside Mi'kmaqi for more than 15,000 years. And the Mi'kmaq language is the greatest authority on questions of ecology and sustainability here, not because it's inherently special, but because the language and the land came into being together. Not in geological terms, perhaps, but certainly in anthropological terms. So I'm not trying to suggest that, the presence of Mi'kmaq people here maybe fundamentally change the geology. What I'm trying to say is the way that human beings mediate our knowledge about the places in which we are emerges in conversation with land and ecologies. And no language, no people, no knowledge seekers have been here longer than the Mi'kmaq. Settler colonialism as a mode of power involves a process of territorial transformation, and it's intended to first render indigenous people alien to the land of their ancestors, and second, attempts to re-indigenize the land on the terms of the settler. So it is a fundamentally transformative and violent process, and it's something that happens in the everyday in ways that oftentimes are not understood. Something as simple as planting foreign crops is actually territorially part of this process. But what settlers don't often understand is that resistance to that doesn't just come from people, it comes from the land itself. And we see this, unfortunately I missed Elle's talk yesterday about it. I know, like, I love Elle's work about animals these days. And I was thinking about that when I was writing these notes, because when we see animals lashing out at human settlements, encroaching on their territories, it's powerful. When whales shit in the water at SeaWorld and then deliberately splash their feces all over the adoring fans who have dutifully bought a ticket, that's a form of resistance to settler colonization. We see it when settler colonial crops fail, right? Because those crops have no history on the land in which they're being planted. And I mentioned to the class, I'll tell you all here too, I was at a conference earlier this year in Ottawa, and I had the pleasure of meeting a Palestinian master's student who is doing his thesis on Israeli green colonialism. You know, that those projects aimed at making the desert bloom, so to speak, over top of overrun Palestinian villages. And what he was looking at was what happens when the crops fail. And in the specific case that he was analyzing, the seeds of the local plants that were not actually planted by anyone, but were just there dormant from the time the village was first overrun, it had deep roots, and it emerged, the crops emerged themselves to break up the Israeli crops that were planted and to reassert the indigenous crops that were emerging from the land, and essentially engaging in what we could call a form of ecological re-territorialization. You know, the overrun of the, yeah, I love it. I was just sitting there cheering for this plant that I'd never even heard of. And what these examples show us, I think, is that the violence of settler colonialism is much more than the violence that happens to human communities. Now, I'll return to that later. I might not, because I kind of ran out of time preparing this and then I just stopped writing, but we'll see how far I get. But the point is that it's a foundation, settler colonization is a foundational violence enacted on land itself. And humans are a part of that, at least in some ontological framings, right? And some of the schism that we're getting to here is that not all worldviews understand humanity as being part of land, particularly the Western Eurocentric visions of human nature divide. But that's not something that's universally true, even though it's been presented as being universally true. So the carbon farms that we call cities, you know, I was thinking about this as I was biking down here from the north end. This is essentially a carbon farm, right? Like all these, if you think about the amount of space that is ceded to cars in our urban spaces, if you were to, I saw something on Facebook the other day where the roads were just treated as invisible space, and you saw people walking huddled on one end of the city, crossing on these narrow bridges of crosswalks. It's actually absurd how we have essentially territorialized our living spaces in about 100 years to make it totally subservient to gas-guzzling cars. Turtle Island itself, you know, is another example, and this is another reason why I can't help but cheer when the weeds break through the pavement and the winter cracks and mutilates our asphalt roads, causing a never-ending cycle of construction just to keep on the arrogant illusion that we control Kjipuktuk. Who's controlling who here, right? From our vantage point, we give what is the municipal budget for just fixing roads? It's unbelievable. Anyway, While the Anishinaabe ontology of land, described by Leanne Simpson, differs in some respects from the Mi'kmaq one articulated by water protectors and grassroots grandmothers like Doreen Bernard, I try to focus on published work. So Doreen is the one who's published on this, but there's obviously so many members in our community who talk about this. You know, there are differences, but they clearly share far more in common than the Western ontology, Western European ontology of land, that only makes land visible and meaningful through the lens of improvement. We might call that development, you know, we might call that capitalism. And when Simpson writes, as she does in a beautiful essay called The Brilliance of Beavers, that settlers saw Algonquin territory as wasted land, she reminds readers that every morning her ancestors woke up and engaged in the labor of creating the conditions for an Algonquin world to come into existence. And it was not the white man labor of 9 to 5 at the factory, but the productive work of relational life and sustaining life. And I just don't know if everybody knows this, but one of the really heartening things that I found during the summer of encampments across this territory was a reflection essay that Leanne Simpson herself wrote when she went to the encampment at University of Toronto, and she described the encampment as the only place with vibrant life thriving in the neoliberal university. You know, the encampments have mattered also for Indigenous scholars and marginalized people across all wakes of life, because they've seen the work and the productive life-generating aspect of these encampments. This is why we all love you guys so much. You're doing the work that we have always failed to do, at least in an institutional way. And Leanne Simpson is a big fan of it too. I think she's even going with Elle to the West Bank in January, but I'm not 100% sure about that. Anyway, I wanted to be able to make connections between that and Palestinian agriculture, but I don't know enough about Palestinian ways of life to attempt to draw parallels. But the point I want to pivot to in setting this land-based context is that in the context of a vicious and ongoing genocide, I don't think we need to bother getting into Zionist-fueled fights about who is and who isn't indigenous to Palestine for a couple of different reasons. And I think you know what I'm talking about, right? There's endless amounts of like Zionist talking points that are trying to say, we've been here forever, we were driven from the land, etc., etc. So here's some of the reasons why I don't think we should take that bait. Whether the Arab, Bedouin, Semite, Muslims, Christians, and Jews who have always been present in the territory of Palestine are indigenous or not is a distraction from the material fact that Palestinian people today are enduring a genocide perpetuated by a settler colonial Israeli state that is invested in the ethno-nationalist project of Jewish supremacy. And none of the history that we might fight about is going to change what's happening right now. So there are two separate projects here. We need to understand the history to understand how to confront the realities that we're facing today, but we don't need to be baited into hypotheticals that are only loosely grounded in any kind of history to dissuade us from this empirical fact that a genocide is happening. None of the Zionist talking points about how all of Judea is Israel is valid, because, and this brings me back to the point of what I'm getting at here, these are fundamentally different conceptions of territory, of territoriality. Biblical territoriality was a little bit different from Roman territoriality, but the two of them had some stuff in common. Ottoman territoriality was significantly different from Roman territoriality, even if it presented itself as the successor to Rome. And then British, French, and Israeli and Palestinian territoriality, that category of territories can be treated as one group, and they operate very differently than the ones that came before it. And we cannot afford to be willy-nilly about how we compare them. We can't just jump across time, place, and logics of state to try to draw comparisons. But let me tell you this, and I don't think you need much convincing about this. If we were to engage in hypothetical considerations, if it were the Mi'kmaq that were engaged in a 400-day campaign of genocide against the white population of Nova Scotia that had been living here for hundreds of years, I assure you the international community would do something to stop it. you and I would do something to stop that. And obviously that wouldn't make us anti-Mi'kmaq to be able to stop that. You know, obviously the Mi'kmaq have never been in the business of committing genocide. Mindfuck of the situation. And the story of modern empire, I think, can help us unpack this. And maybe, if we're lucky, start to imagine some ways out. But before I say that, I also wanted to give a shout out to one of the students who in class the other day, we're reading Decolonizing Palestine, and it's written by a somebody who's obviously on side for the decolonization of Palestine. But he pointed out how even this author, on occasion, textually, in writing about the book, uses the word Islamist in reference to Hamas, and brought this to the foreground of our discussion and said, the word Islamist is fundamentally this kind of anti-terror word. It doesn't mean Islam. It's sometimes used in that way, and in the sloppy ways that we kind of move between, this terminology, by allowing that level of sloppiness, we endanger ourselves to very imprecise language, which in and of itself isn't such a big deal. But if you consider what the project of the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism is, to my mind, this is an organized project to try to create the conditions to make people slip up as much as possible, to accidentally say Jewish when they mean Zionist, and for people, especially people coming from multiple languages, the meaning of what they're trying to say falls victim to the literal semiotic position that they've taken. And when I've talked to people, I think honestly, when I've talked to people, particularly people where English is not the first language, and I say, as I always do, I think you're talking about Zionism, you're not talking about Judaism. They always say, yes, of course. But that's not what we hear. That's not what we hear. And, is that filming or is it just,
Yeah.
It's film, okay. That'll mildly change what I'm going to say next, but that's okay. Anyway, all that to say, we cannot afford to fall into the traps that have been laid carefully for us and endorsed by our government to prevent us in what is obviously the just cause of organizing to stop a genocide. So, the point that I'll make here, where was I? Yeah, we're in the mindfuck of the colonial situation. So travel with me, if you will, to the 19th century. The only way to exist in the 19th century at the international level, without being, interfered with, to put it politely, by others, was to be an empire. In the 19th century, this is why the first free state in the entire Western Hemisphere called themselves the Empire of Haiti in 1805. It was a defensive maneuver. This is why Meiji Japan in the 1860s constituted itself as an empire to fend off European empires that had recently and temporarily brought the mighty Han empires of China to their knees with their chosen tools of violence, international trade, and drugs. As the Guinean international relations scholar Siva Gravogi has explained, in the 19th century, there existed two sets of rules for international politics. One set of rules for Africa. Siva was talking about Africa mostly, but I think we can extend his analysis to the rest of the colonized world. And then importantly, another set of rules for international relations for Europe. Even the weak and largely insignificant countries of Europe, like Belgium, were given a privileged position in this discourse of international relations. And it was in order to serve the hubris of European imperial expansion. So, for example, and Siva goes into great detail on this, Belgium was allowed in the late 19th century to colonize the Congo to create the colonial conditions and genocidal conditions that have put generations of Congolese people into, great situations of horror. Like, I'm not going to get into the details, but it was one of the most vicious and one of the most recent examples of Western Europe doing this on the rubber plantations across the Congo. And what it showed was the absolute, as Ami Césaire points out, the absolute thingification of African people. literal, that they could be punished by the removal of arms. I'm talking like, I don't mean guns, I mean arms, I mean like appendages as punishment for not turning up for work on these rubber plantations. Children killed by slave masters in this period. And nobody in the Western world did anything about it. Like, far from it. It was seen as a necessary evil in order to keep the peace. You know, this period from about 1815 to 1914 in world history, if you follow the Eurocentric historians, they call that 100 years of peace. That was 100 years of organized imperial and state violence and terror against the global majority of this world. That's the period of time that I study, and I tell you, there was absolutely nothing peaceful about it outside of Europe. If you take seriously Africa, Asia, the Pacific region, and Turtle Island. Where was I here? Sorry, I go off on these tangents. So anyway, what affected the logic, the imperial logic that allowed ordinary human beings, because by and large, I'm not trying to demonize European people here at all, right? I recognize most of you here are of European ancestry. Obviously you ruled, and probably a lot of your ancestors did too. I don't like these meta-narratives of history that try to pretend that everybody was in agreement everywhere because some shitty king or prime minister took a position, right? We are not represented by Justin Trudeau. We sure as hell aren't going to be represented by Pierre Poilievre, or any of the ones who came before or after them. People's history are always different from the statist histories, but the state histories are important because they're the ones who do the really awful shit. So this logic of the state, the logic of white supremacy, this was accepted in Western Europe, who had been on the ascent for the preceding couple hundred years, fueled by their preferred engines of genocide and slavery. And people in these countries, scientists even in these countries, were trying to explain why white people were dominating the world. And they couldn't possibly conceive of the fact that they were doing it because they were murdering and enslaving their equals. So the logic of race developed as a pseudo-scientific attempt to explain how human development progressed on a so-called linear function. As if it wasn't that white Europeans were doing what they were doing. It was some sort of inevitable thrust of history. And this is stuff that, like, folks like Hegel and others, they were really invested in this idea that human society just moves along this kind of divine-inspired path, like we're being pulled almost by a string attached to our very hearts and souls. Hegel's if you've not read Hegel, you should read Hegel. It's a real experience. Actually, fuck that. You don't need to. Just read people who wrote about Hegel. There are better things to read. Right, yeah. So the logic of race was applied in this pseudo-scientific attempt to justify this linear function. And what that does, the work that does, allows hypotheticals, historical hypotheticals, to take up space when we should be thinking about the things that actually happened. And you all have experiences with this, right? How many of you have some uncle or somebody in your life who's like, okay, well, I just want to play devil's advocate. What if this? What if that? Well, this is basically what these race scientists were kind of musing about in the 19th century. They said, they mused that, well, it's true that Europeans are engaging in this kind of violence, but if it wasn't us, it would have been somebody else, right? As if the Mi'kmaq or the Cherokee or the Ibu or the Indian would be doing exactly the same thing. I didn't see any transatlantic slave trade to work on rice plantations in China. You know what I mean? I'm not suggesting, again, I'm not applauding the Chinese government. I'm saying they didn't engage in a transatlantic slave trade of European people. We have to be concerned with the history that happened, not with the history that hypothetically could have happened under completely different circumstances. So, this racial logic was foundational to the establishment of the international state system after 1885. I'll pick 1885 as the go-to because this was the so-called Concert of Berlin, where basically a group of white guys, most of whom had never been to Africa, took out some rulers and their map of Africa and drew a bunch of very straight lines to justify how to divide up African territory. So from that moment, that logic of thinking, the logic of white guys dividing up lines on the maps where they've never been or rarely been, it informed the logic of the League of Nations and its successor, the United Nations. It's not everything about it, right? Immanuel Kant's thinking, the objectives of perpetual peace, and trying to add, like, they were trying to do some good stuff too. But what I'm getting at is the subconscious logic was one of white supremacy. And when I say white supremacy, I'm not talking about Nazis. The Nazis did not exist in the 19th century. What I'm talking about is the systematic privileging of Eurocentric ideas as being the only ideas with validity. And I'm going to circle back to that when we'll talk about Said in a little bit, because he was really good on that. So this racial logic gives us our international institutions. So the measure of successful state territory in the industrious, value-producing, and white supremacist societies of Europe and its settler colonies was the logic in which we were engaging. And even here in Canada, Canada was like an openly white supremacist country until after the Second World War. This was not something, like, Canada was proud about this, you know? They wanted Chinese people here to build a railroad, and then they wrote policies to kick them out. They wrote policies to prevent Indian people in the 1908 continuous journey legislation to prevent us from being able to come to Canada, even though we were all allegedly subjects in the same British Empire, and we had, technically speaking, the right of mobility. So they created separate laws to justify that. That's what gave rise to the Commonwealth of Maru. And when they were at it, they actually forgot that African people could walk across the border. So they had to make a special order in council in 1911 to say that black people can't come because it's too cold here. You know, tell that to the enslaved Africans and who had been here since the 1600s. Think it's too cold? Man, their hearts were too cold, baby. So, where am I here? Sorry. This is the logic. This is what passes as a country that is going to be self-sustaining at the end of the 19th century and early 20th century. But now enter into that story, a story of a subordinated white population. And I'm not talking about the Irish, I'm not talking about Eastern Europeans. Here, I'm talking about hundreds of years of Jewish Europeans, many who had been living at the mercy of Christian anti-Semitism for generations. Many Jews, if you take the 400 years between about 1500 and 1900, they actually preferred life in the Islamic Ottoman Empire. Because in the Ottoman Empire, you could just pay a tax for not being a Muslim and by and large be left alone. And this was the kind of stated policy objectives of the early Ottoman Empire as well. That they wanted the best and the brightest of the world, so they didn't care what your religion was, and they actually saw it as a form of revenue generation. You know, it's kind of like good statecraft, if you like states, to just bring people and charge them a tax for being smart. It's better than the alternative, right? We can't compare by today's standards. So, by comparison, in Europe, you never knew what was coming for you. You never knew when the state would scapegoat you. You didn't know when the pogroms were coming. There was not a consistent way to live freely and openly Jewish in Western Europe because of the Christian supremacy and the white supremacy, within which sought to isolate and push out of that sense of evolving nation Jewish people who were by all legitimate bases. You know, they were Russians, they were Poles, they were Germans, they were British, they were all of these things. Because religion, people confuse religion for ethnicity and race and all these other things. It's not the same thing. So this is why the early logic of Zionism and the project for a Zionist state in Palestine was motivated, as Mohammed Ayash explains, by appealing to the logic of white Christian supremacy. If we follow Ayash's logic through, reading Theodore Herschel, and then we apply it to the politics that were unfolding in the early 20th century, part of the reason why the Zionists were able to convince the British of the validity of a Jewish homeland in Palestine in particular is because they were able to present the project of Israel as a settler colonial project that necessarily treated indigenous people as backwards and inconsequential to the linear development of history. That's a really important piece. And obviously they weren't using the term settler colonial. Settler colonial is a term they started using popularly because of indigenous scholars in the 1960s. It doesn't matter what term we use. Part of the project of history is you have to look and follow the breadcrumbs, right? But this is the logic that they were working under. And as Edward Said explains masterfully in his classic book, Orientalism, from, I think it was 77, when the white Christian straight male body is understood to be powerful, potent, and smart, and then the feminized Oriental other, understood for Said to be mostly Arab, Turk, or Persian, but I think more broadly applicable to colonized people, these people, under that rubric of thinking, are seen as being driven by desire, by emotions. They're ultimately devoid of rational thought necessary to be true drivers of human history and human society. That same script that was applied to Palestinians 100 years ago then, ascribing them as being driven by passion, driven by being backwards, ultimately just being a few dozen farmers, which is not true. But, you know, to the men who were trying to be convinced, most of them had very little actual experience in the territory. The same script of Palestinians being irrational, violent, and inferior to white European desires for imperial expansion was the same script used here on Turtle Island and elsewhere in the bloated British Empire. And by the time of the First World War, the geopolitics of Europe was such that the British were really being motivated by a desire to stop the French from expanding their empire into the Middle East. So a lot of these kind of core geopolitical decisions were actually happening in closed-door cabinet meetings. I don't mean like government cabinet meetings, but also those. Closed-door meetings with maybe 12 or 13 men sitting around, drawing lines on maps, and making decisions based on what they believe their knowledge of the region is. I want to highlight the Sykes-Picot framework. Anybody heard of the Sykes-Picot framework? Nobody. I only heard about it recently. Everybody talks about the Balfour Declaration, right, in 1917. But before the Balfour Declaration, there was the Sykes-Picot framework of 1915, and I think it's incredibly important for a couple of reasons. One, Balfour was in the room for that. He wasn't the one signing the papers and doing most of the negotiation, but Lord Balfour was in the room, and what this was an agreement to try to start dividing up the Middle East and giving it its sort of contemporary cartography. And it was Balfour in the room who was saying, hey, I don't think that's a good idea. I don't really understand how you can take 5% of the population and give them like half of the land. That doesn't seem very fair to the 95% of the population who've been there for a really long time. And that's not the kind of position that we normally associate with Balfour. And I only learned about this one because I was listening to a podcast that William Dalrymple, who's a really well-established historian of the British Empire. I'm not suggesting that y'all just go listen to podcasts and think you understand the Middle East. But in this case, I've read this guy. He's a good historian. Trust me on that one. But what he talks about is this really crazy story leading up to the Balfour Declaration, where Lord Balfour and one of the Zionists organizers, whose names I don't remember, he was trying to convince Balfour of the validity of what would become his own declaration. And they had dinner the night before it got signed, and in the records, in the archival records, they walked each other home from dinner 3 times in both directions. So they were really involved in the conversation or something. And after that, Balfour gets up the next day and declares himself a Zionist. So there was definitely, some buddy-buddy behavior happening in that lead-up. And I don't think we should see that as particularly outrageous. That's sort of just how politics works, right? This is how power operates. They tell us it's democracy, and it's really a whole lot of buddyocracy. So anyway, the imperial logic is what I wanted to draw your attention to, because at this point, the imperial logic of the British Empire was one where the British Empire was increasingly afraid of its own future. And that was happening because of the anti-colonial activities of Indians, of Africans, and of the empire more generally, all over the world, including, the predominantly Arab population in Palestine. So this notion, and maybe I'll leave it here and then we can open up to questions after this. This notion of partition is where I want to end, because the idea of partitioning a territory to give it to deserving people was actually weirdly kind of evangelical religiosity of colonial administrators in the early 20th century. And it was a period that connects, you can look at the archives of the British Empire and see that there was like an evangelical turn in governance from about the 1820s that continued well into the 20th century. And these were the men who were really invested in modernity, enlightenment, and this kind of Hegelian approach that I kind of took you all through, because they would have grown up in that shadow. But partition became the logic at least as early as 1830. In Sri Lanka, which is a country I write a lot about, this first idea of, the colonial project getting in and just creating new maps, big part of that. Totally re-territorialized the island as a very deliberate way to undermine the power of the local authorities in the center of the island. More contemporarily, we can look at 1905 and the initial partition of Bengal, and then taking us right up to Israel here, we can see the absolutely absurd notion of religious state territoriality at the heart of the partition of India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Israel, and Palestine, all of which happens in 1948. That's not an accident, folks. One of the projects that one of the projects that I'm working on these days is a book called Colonial Losers, The Mediocre Men Who Made Empire. And the more I look at this history, the more I think, man, these were not brilliant people. These were desperate people, had no idea. They were concerned that their cummerbunds didn't match or something like that. Whatever it is that they kind of do. They were the lesser sons of more important people who were going all over the imperial world, trying to make it a name, trying to pretend that they were more important than they were. And when we demystify the solidity with which we give credo to the world that they made, I think that's the basis upon which we can start imagining the inherent legitimacy of the worlds that we all build through our practice, through our actions, through our activities, through our study, and through our deep consultations with the people who actually know what the fuck is going on. Because it certainly wasn't these dudes. And because of that, I think that ultimately is going to be the pathway forward when we start taking seriously the positions of people. Doesn't matter, like I said earlier, it doesn't matter if Palestinians are indigenous or not. I happen to think that they are. Palestinians that I talk to also happen to think that they are. But that doesn't matter, because you can't commit a genocide against anybody, motherfuckers. What the hell? At no point is that okay. And yet, we live in this world of imperial shadow, where somehow the Palestinian exception allows this to go on way beyond. Honestly, the imperialists in the United States probably didn't even think it was going to go on this long. But of course it's going to go on this long if you continue to give free open rein to, a Zionist project who, in the detailed politics of the Israeli Knesset of right now, is going to take this to whatever conclusion they see fit. And that's not even a mystery. That is literally what Netanyahu says every time somebody puts a camera in front of him. There is no more evidence that is possible. This is what's happening. And unless there's a straight up end to the arms embargo, I don't know that there's anything else that people can do at this point that isn't already trying to be done. So it's got to be that. I'm not going to get in the way and tell activists what to do. People know what to do on their own. They've learned what to do on their own. But all I want to do is try to offer a little bit of the historical perspective so that we can see, maybe if I summarize it into a couple of points here. The first point that I was trying to make here is that there are a lot of similarities between Palestine and Turtle Island. And there's a lot of differences too. And the fact that there are differences doesn't change the fact that the similarities are vast and they should be pursued. And they are. The second point is that to understand how we end up in this like colonial nightmare of a situation, we have to turn to the history. And I think that imperial state formation is super important for understanding that, because that's the logic, the subconsciousness of the state, and it's woven into the territory and naturalized through our international systems. And then the third and last point is that the men who did this work are not that smart, and since they're not that smart, we can outsmart them. Yeah. Thank you very much. Question is, what led me to become a professor with this background? Zeitoun University. Yeah, no, absolutely. Like, Zeitoun University provided me the opportunity and the necessity to do that. Because by and large, I'm a historian of 19th century Sri Lanka. That's what I do. And I'm not even really a historian. I'm actually a political scientist. Like, so, you know, I work in a history department, and then the students took this position, and just part of supporting their work, I got the opportunity, I would call it an opportunity to try to deepen my understanding around Palestine, because if I'm being honest, and this is not something I'm proud of, but historically, like when I was a student, I was so outraged my whole life about Palestine. You know, like when I was a kid growing up, the first book that I ever like got from my read from my dad's library was a book on Palestine from 1974. It was a photography book, and I remember just being like 5 years old, 7 years old, and just couldn't understand the irrational cruelty that this particular subset of people had been experiencing at that point for not that long. And I was so angry about it as a student growing up that I actually, for methodological reasons, did not pursue studying the Middle East and Palestine. It wasn't because I wasn't deeply interested, but it was because I didn't have the courage to think that I could pursue that objectively, based on the way that I was trained, right? Based on what my professors were telling me. Oh, you're too passionate about this. You're too passionate about colonialism. You're too passionate about race. Go write about a place that you have no connection to. Because that's really that's the Western logic, right, of the university. They want us to be disassociated from struggle. They want us to be some kind of outside experts. So I've written all kinds of stuff about like things, places that I've never been, and it's not something. When I see that the students are in a position to just ignore that, to throw that superstructure off and be like, no, I care about this because this is happening, and I'm studying these things. One of the things that one of the students who actually wasn't involved in the encampment but came to me in November of 2023 in tears and just said, I don't understand why I'm studying international law. What is the point of studying international law when no country, no lawyers, no anybody can intervene to stop a genocide? And I didn't have an answer. So part of the pursuit of that answer was like, now I'm going to study this stuff. And the history is incredible. Obviously, what Palestinian scholars have written on this, what a lot of Israeli scholars have written on this, has been amazing. So I encourage everybody to kind of read deeply on it. But yeah, that's my story. I was too angry and too involved in activism as a student, so I was guided away from studying it. And now as a professor, I'm learning from my students that that's not a reason. So now I'm doing it.
I got to follow up. Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So all these people are amazing, and I have nothing but respect for everybody here and you. And you're also educating and preaching to people who are like-minded.
Yeah.
I'm sure we all have. I definitely have people in my world who are good people.
Yeah.
Who who don't like colonization, but they're not taking the extra steps to educate themselves about Palestine in particular because of media and blah blah blah. Do you have any advice or particular books that we can, information that we could give people who are not on the side but want to know more but are not taking their own steps to do that?
Yeah, really good question. So the question is, how do we help the folks who maybe aren't as committed to this political project, but are, broadly speaking, opposed to colonization and they need some opportunities to deepen their understanding? So that's actually a project that myself and my pal Alex Kasnavish have been really dedicated to over the last 5 years, but not specific to Palestine, but Palestine has obviously come up with it. So we have, I know this sounds like I'm touting my own horn here, but I'll start with the stuff that I've done because it's close to me and it's free for the most part, or nearly free. We have 26 YouTube shows called Safe Space for White Questions. And obviously this isn't just about white people, right? But a lot of racialized people watch it too. And what we do in that show is we just take questions that people are too afraid to ask in public, that they write to us, literally they're actual submissions that people have sent to us. Things like, is it, why can't you be racist against white people? Or how do I explain what's going on in Palestine to, my auntie or something like that? These are the kinds of questions, and then Alex and I just go back and forth trying to model, unprepared answers. Because part of the project there is that we shouldn't feel that we got to be experts on everything to intervene and to explain. And that's how we actually shape and change, I think, public discourse. Because right now, the state, especially the adoption of the IHRA, has had such a dampening effect on discourse on this because people are terrified to talk about it. So I think we need to ignore it and talk about it as much as possible. The other resource that we have, if it's more like one of those things where maybe they're not going to watch a YouTube show, we wrote a book called Frequently Asked White Questions, where we took the most common questions and answered them in a book. There's lots of and it's intended for people exactly like you've described. They're good people. They're not activists. It would be a useless book probably if you're already an activist. Don't tell the publisher I said that though. that's a poor sales pitch. But in it, it's basically it's intended to be I had a grad school colleague who said, when you're teaching people things that they don't want to hear, you have to pretend that they're deer. And you just have to kind of offer the food and just let them come to you with no sudden movements. So Frequently Asked White Questions is a really chill, we attempt to be funny at times. We're modeling it as a kind of direct critique of kind of Jordan Peterson and that style of thing. So they had top 10, this and that and the other. So that's been that's what we've produced. It's hard to move people to read things in this day and age. So if they instead need to be immersed with what they see as more middle of the ground analysis, and this is not a critique, but I would encourage them to check out stuff written by independent Jewish voices. The Jewish organizations that are opposed to colonization are really effective in helping people to think. The very first article I ever wrote on Palestine back in 2010, I co-wrote with somebody from IJB who literally left. He was a foreign policy officer and he resigned without his pension from the Harper government because he was disgusted at Canadian foreign policy in Israel. So when I think about Terry and the kind of learning I did with Terry, it helped me not ask dumb questions to Palestinians, if you know what I mean. Because I feel that's a really important part, to put the burden on people who are enduring genocidal violence and have been surviving it for generations. A lot of us who have a bit of sense, we know not to bug people with that. So we need to find other people. That's what Alex and I are trying to do for racialized people, right? It's okay, come and talk to us about this stuff. Leave people alone, before you go talk to or somebody else, the activists who are engaged in the work. Come talk to us who will answer these questions, and then when you're ready to have a meaningful conversation, then you bug or others. But do the homework first. I think that's where we meet these folks. And we gotta let them know that we're not trying to throw them out. Nobody's perfect, we come imperfect, and we learn together. And Zeitoun is a great space for that too, I tell a lot of people, when the encampment was up, just go to the encampment. Everybody was trying to come through me about the encampment. It's I'm not a part of the encampment. I'm supporting the encampment. I respect their autonomy. So go, bring cookies, have a conversation. I don't know. Does anybody else have good resources for that, about how to help people who are on the fence and need a little extra support? Well, let's just start anyway. Yeah. Yes, please.
I don't know if obvious, but like just I like genuinely like just I'm fully understanding that everybody is coming with us and like coming and speaking to somebody with like a sense of compassion and like I don't know, being aware that if somebody is interested in learning more, that it's just and like obviously I'm speaking on this as a white woman who has like has like space to be able to do that, but like really trying to like come together and find common ground and like meeting people where they are.
Yeah, I'm trying to, so just for those of you who couldn't hear, the comment was that really trying to come together and meet people where they are is really important. And I definitely agree. And for me anyways, some of that has been through history, right? Because if we agree, right, that, you know, colonialism is a bad thing, then if we can understand what the steps were, like the colonial steps that connect this to the other, the fact that people are actually complicated, we're not just one thing, we're actually many things, that like white people were, yeah, on the one hand settlers, and also people who were plotting alongside the colonized to try and overthrow the government. That's also real history. Priyambada Gopal actually wrote a wonderful book called Insurgent Empire, John? Yeah, Insurgent Empire. John and I co-taught a course where that was the only book we read. And it was a big tome of a book. It was an amazing way to think about post-colonial politics. And it was motivated because Priyambada Gopal, she's a professor of post-colonial literature at Cambridge. I went and hung out with her in Cambridge last summer. And I asked her, what was your motivation for this book? And she told me candidly, I teach at one of the most Ivy League universities in the whole damn world. I get the most privileged students the world is even capable of producing, and they are so irritating. And the reason why they're so irritating is because they're all imperially nostalgic. And they're like, I want to go back to the grand old times of the British Empire. And she's like, you don't have to do that. You can actually look for heroes in your own community who stood up and fought against the empire. So she wrote a 500-page book on the subject called Insurgent Empires, where she's like, okay, look at these white people who are supporting like the rebellions in Jamaica. Look at these white people who are doing this and that and the other. So don't love the empire. You know, that's like the kind of message there. Don't love the empire. Love the people who fight against it. And that they come from all walks of life. We should do some exercises or something, try to warm up, yeah? The sun has moved. Anybody got anything else? Alright, well, why don't we just be a little more casual, get some coffee, and chat. On till the next thing. Thank you so much.